Hey, and welcome to this spoiler-ridden spooky season video on Dead Space 3 by me, the lazy writer, who finally has some footage of a game, so for once you won't have to spend too long staring into the abyss of my abysmal editing. If you've watched my Little Nightmares videos, you might remember me saying that the first two Dead Space games are amongst my all-time favourites, and if you watched that video and happen to be an attentive viewer with the knowledge of video games in the horror genre from the last 10 years, as I imagine you all are, you might have thought to yourself, he didn't mention the third major installment in the Dead Space series, Dead Space 3, because that game is notorious for not being anywhere near as good as its predecessors. And to you, my mystery viewer who definitely does exist, I say, you are correct. Except for all the ways in which you're wrong. Because you are wrong. Very wrong. You fool. And that is why, today, I will be defending Dead Space 3. Of course, it is true that I don't like 3 as much as the previous games in the series, otherwise I would have mentioned it at the same time as I brought up those two. However, I certainly don't think it's as horrible as a lot of people seem to make out, and I wouldn't even place it as average, which seemed to be the general critical consensus and outsiders' opinion. I feel that a lot of its bad reputation is unjust, and that, whilst EA's changes were undoubtedly poor, there's still a great game under the ice. I recently replayed it and had a really fun time, so above all I just want to look at some of the ideas surrounding the game and say what I felt about the end of the trilogy. By far the most prominent criticism that I've seen levelled at the game by fans of the franchise is that, unlike previous entries, it is not really a horror game, instead focusing too heavily on action and all that boring drama and love triangle stuff that has no place in the game about dismembering reanimated corpses and stomping on them until they give you loot, goddammit. And I'll definitely concede that I never cared for the subplot about Isaac heavily third-wheeling his ex's new relationship, especially as it forced the formerly capable Ellie into the role of damsel in distress. I'll also admit that there's a lot more emphasis on action this time, with largely uninspired cover shooter sections and more scripted events and boss fights than in the first two games combined. Probably. Don't look that up. However, even though there's less of the desperately shambling through the dark, petrified of what might be lurking round each corner, there are new brands of horror that bleed through every second of Dead Space 3, and it innovates around certain issues to prove scarier in certain fields, in my opinion, than anything 1 or 2 ever managed. We can't be as easily or as thoroughly scared by the same thing in the third time around as we were the first and second times. Isaac will probably never get used to the terror of human bodies tearing themselves into new shapes designed to kill him as brutally as possible, but he's as used to it as he's ever going to be, so they'll never replicate the fear of those initial encounters with necromorph kind. Therefore they branch out into new areas, introducing new varieties of undead that include the alien necromorph, the creeper, the feeder, the medusa, the nexus, the regenerator, the shambler, the snow beast, the swarm and the waster, each of which we experience with a new sense of anticipation. We dread every fight with the snow beast, we're unprepared for the chaos of the shamblers, and we're horrified as we uncover the audio logs to teach us the story of the feeders, and the possibility that somewhere, deep inside, they're still technically human. The Brethren Moons are the greatest example of a cosmic, inevitable, unerring threat that I've ever seen in fiction, barring perhaps Cthulhu, answering the Fermi paradox in the scariest way possible. The great filter, that reason that no alien civilization has ever been discovered, is that they are all extinct. They all fell to the Brethren Moons. We are almost entirely alone in the cold, dark void Dead Space, accompanied only by the unavoidable enemy, which will pick off our entire species as though we were nothing. I can't be angry at Carver for letting Danik effectively end humanity, because ultimately it would have happened either way. Yes, there is more action throughout Dead Space 3 than there was in the second game, and a lot more than there was in the first, but the horror hasn't left, it's simply found a new host, and personally, that existential threat, the horrific answer to some of the biggest questions plaguing humanity, has stuck with me a lot longer than even the excellent atmosphere and scariest moments of the first two games in the series. Another criticism I've seen is of the more EA elements of 3. That is to say that you can buy better weapons with real-world money and bypass the hours of collecting items and resources by simply carrying out a few microtransactions. Furthermore, to experience the true ending, and therefore to get the full story, you have to pay for the Awakened DLC on top of the original game. In this DLC, you see Isaac and Carver discovering that the Brethren Moons have followed the distress signal sent out by the Frozen Moon from the main game, and are only able to watch on as Earth is surrounded by the gargantuan harbingers of humanity's end. And these are criticisms that I agree with. It's true that you don't have to buy your way through resources to get the full experience of the core game, and that you can't immediately buy all of the best weapons at the start of your first playthrough. But you still have to purchase the downloadable content in order to experience the full story, and the existence of microtransactions still encourages the splashing of cash on elements that really should have been available to all players for the reasonable price of whatever one copy of Dead Space 3 cost back in 2013. Any other charge is just rewarding players for buying into your greed, and, well, I won't go off on that tangent any more than I already have, but you can see why this is a point that some players are still sore on, particularly long-time fans of the series who might have saved up to afford the game, only to discover that they were buying, 80% of it, and the rest was all behind a paywall. Splitting the difference between my feelings on that and my feelings on the horror elements of Dead Space 3 is the game's introduction of weapon customization, which has seen mixed responses in the years since its release, and I can see why. On one hand, combining and otherwise customizing weapons takes away the iconic and universally consistent weapons of 1 and 2, and the decisions that you had to make regarding weapon slots before embarking on each journey, knowing how difficult it would be if you'd made the wrong choice. For those reasons, I wasn't a big fan at first, although in my recent playthrough I created a truly devastating weapon and very quickly fell in love. Needing to improve your weapons did add new elements, meaning that harvesting resources was imperative, which had you scanning every dark corner for something that you could turn into firepower, as well as necessitating decisions regarding which components you could afford to spend, and how was best to do so. Nonetheless, I'm always glad when I go back to the previous games that the plasma cutter will always be the plasma cutter, and I don't have to worry about updating it every time I go to a bench. It means that you can go through the earlier games with a bit more freedom, without slowing everything down so that you can find all the goodies tucked away in each chapter. I suppose I'm glad that both options exist throughout the stories, and that the more action-focused game is the one in which you have customization options, whilst the more traditional horror experience has the grab whatever you can and use it to survive feeling of only having a handful of weapons, none of which you have the option to add to or alter in any meaningful way. Nonetheless, I'm still conflicted over the system in Dead Space 3, though certainly not as unhappy as I was about the paywall. Overall, I still found it to be a genuinely great game. The action is more fluid than that of the first game in particular, and I really like the story, especially discovering the frozen planet of Tau Volantis, the larger threat of the Brethren Moons, and a new friend in John Carver. I'm never a fan of when entries in a series are derided for having differences to their predecessors, not least when there's still a lot of quality and innovation to be appreciated, which is certainly the case here. I can only hope that we see a glimpse of that quality in the upcoming remake of the original game, as well as in games like the Callisto Protocol, which is being developed by Dead Space alumni, and A Negative Atmosphere, which is heavily inspired by the series. Perhaps there'll even be a bit of a review of 3 in the general consensus, and a moment of redemption for Isaac, Carver, and the series as a whole. Thanks for watching this video. I really do appreciate every view. I'd also really love it if you could go and listen to some more of these guys, because between you and me, my videos would be 10 times more boring without the music. And if you liked this video or had any comments or suggestions, please do leave a like or a comment, and I will see you all next time.